Kintsugi Heroes acknowledges funding and was made possible with support from the Community Broadcasting Foundation. Find out more at cbf.org.au.
Welcome to the Kintsugi Heroes podcast, where we share inspirational stories of everyday people going through different challenges and how they overcome them. Please be aware that the story you're about to hear may have moments of deeply felt emotions and personal experiences. If anything you hear has a triggering effect, please reach out to someone who can help keep you safe. If you love this conversation, we'd love you to like and share it with your friends so we can continue to share more inspiration and hope to as many people as possible. Now, listen up for our next hero story.
This week, Kerry Atherton is talking to Stacey Uhrig. Stacey is a trauma specialist and shares her deeply personal battle with childhood trauma and hyperindependence. Facing 2 nervous breakdowns, she sought different therapies, including clinical hypnotherapy and inner child work. Stacey's story unveils her struggles with autoimmune conditions and the impactful discoveries from authors Brene Brown and Don Miguel Ruiz. Through her resilience, she now finds peace and helps others heal by reframing subconscious beliefs using rapid transformational therapy and starting their own healing journey. Enjoy this one with Stacey Uhrig.
Welcome to another episode of Kintsugi Heroes. Today's guest is Stacey Uhrig. Stacey's overcome a lot of trauma in her own childhood, and today she's working as a trauma specialist, helping other people heal. Welcome, Stacey.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you? Great to have you on the show today.
I'm great. I'm in New Jersey in the US, so it's evening over here already.
That's right, and it's first thing in the morning over here.
Yeah.
Your mind, when we talk about neuroscience and the mind and all that, your mind will be working a lot better than mine at the moment.
Maybe, but it's been a long day, so it's hard to say, right? I'm at the end, you're at the beginning.
Yeah, true. Can you tell us a bit about a day in the life of Stacey?
Oh, that's such a great question. I've never had that question. Day in the life of Stacey, it's different every single day. I'll use today as an example. Today, I met with 3 individual clients. That's a really great number. Sometimes I have 5, sometimes I have 1 or none, right? 3 is a beautiful amount of time. And my clients I see individually one-on-one, and they come to me because they're generally very stuck in life.
Yeah.
And what they're starting to realize is that the part of the stuckness is that the way that they're navigating life is through their own unhealed wounds. So the things that they think, the things that they interpret, the way that they navigate the world is through a lens of an unhealed wound. And so they often come to me to help them identify what those wounds are and to find out how to heal them so they can actually live a more peaceful life.
And there's no one greater than you that has the lived experience of going through adverse childhood experiences and learning to heal yourself. And in our previous discussion, I know that took you a long time. But
Yeah,
there's
it did.
nobody greater than someone with that lived experience of trauma and post-traumatic stress to help someone else come out the other side.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Stacey, can you take us back to where your trauma began?
Yeah, I'm blessed to be able to say I actually really can remember it. It's like I know when it was. It's no mystery for me. Because for a lot of people, it is a mystery. They can't really pinpoint the stuck point, right? Or when it started. I think when it really started for me was when my parents got a divorce. And it took me a really long time to figure that out. Because even though my parents got divorced in the 80s and it wasn't common, divorce wasn't as common as it is now, it was never really addressed as this major incident.
And really, I don't think the actual divorce itself was an issue. What did create scenarios where my father was not as present as he had been. But in retrospect, my father wasn't really present when he was home anyway, which was part of what led to the divorce, right? But I grew up in a household that I would never say was marked by drama or chaos. I believe my own interpretation is that my household was very, very calm, very, very peaceful. I think for my mother, it was very frustrating because I think she felt she was single parenting. From my perspective, what I felt was love and security and comfort and safety and a place where I could just be myself. Where the adversity came in was my parents very, very quickly both remarried. So it was 1983. I'll paint you the picture. 1983, they get divorced in August. My dad is remarried by November. My mother's remarried by January. And she's telling me in February she's having a baby in June. So,
Hey.
and in the middle of that, we moved. And we moved from our childhood home because my mother was getting remarried and we were moving to a new town and a new home. And so, again, the adversity there was, yes, this was a lot of things happening at one time, but really what I was able to pinpoint and put language to was that what I see often in my friends who end up getting a divorce and becoming a step parent, they really feel it's a bonus to be able to grow their family. And I hear this term a lot. Oh, I'm a bonus parent. This is my bonus child. What I've been able to recognize is part of the trauma, part of the unhealed wound for me was that we were definitely not seen as the bonus in either situation. And we really were the burden and the baggage. It wasn't as though each person that my parent was marrying was interested in the whole package. They were really just interested in the parent. And we were kind of just, I guess we'll have to take them to
Yeah.
kind of thing. You could feel it. And
Yeah.
you could feel it every time you were in each household. So I ended up feeling, you remember that Miley Cyrus song when she's on the wrecking ball? That's how I felt. I felt like I was on this wrecking ball and I just was swinging from home to home, but I had no anchor.
Yeah.
So I went from this very peaceful, comfortable, secure, safe environment where I could be myself up until the age of 11 to two households where I could no longer be myself because I had to find a way to fit in because I didn't feel welcomed or accepted or wanted. So I had to quickly abandon parts of myself in order to find that safety and security. I didn't recognize then that that's what was happening, but I can say now through my own training, my own healing, my own work, that that was really a very, very defining time in my life.
Wow. And it's extremely unsettling, isn't it, when children can't predict the atmosphere?
Very. To the point where I remember being in therapy, I don't know, maybe in my 20s. And the way I described the household, the therapist asked me if one of my step parents was an alcoholic. And I said, it's really funny you should say that because none of my parents, none of the four really were heavy alcohol drinkers at all. But it was the unpredictability of what's going to walk through the door and how do my parts then of me have to basically armor up to predict and protect for the environment. And it was very unpredictable.
Yeah.
There was nothing consistent about it. And that really started me on a journey of probably a good 20 years of just hypervigilance on 24/7 because I had to be ready to go because I never knew what was going to be coming through the door.
So can we talk about that state? Because we hear of fight and flight, but there's
Yeah.
also freeze and appease.
Yeah.
As us therapists that work in the trauma area know, and a lot of people really don't understand that. So as a trauma therapist, can you just explain a bit about that to the listeners today for anybody that's in that state, but they don't know which one they're actually in.
Absolutely. So, these are very adaptive responses to threat, right? And it's typically an adaptation of threat of our security or safety, right? So security thinking, am I enough? Do I belong? Am I okay? As far as connection. And then safety could be, that in addition to perhaps any kind of harm that you could be enduring, right? And so our brain, I have a little brain model here. I'll pull it down.
Awesome.
Our brain has a little tiny piece in the middle called the amygdala. And the amygdala, I always see it as like the DEFCON alarm center. It's like the command center of your reaction under threat of stress in your mind and in your brain. And when that gets engaged, there are kind of four main responses that we pull from. The first one is fight. Think that that's very self-explanatory. It can show up as edginess or obstinance or rage or anger or behaviors that we see in children that we don't like to see, volatility. It can be very physical, it can be very verbal. Flee is literally just getting up and walking away from the situation. Under stress, can't say a word and just gets up and walks away.
And escape at any cost.
Escape, absolutely.
Walking out of relationships, walking out of situations, changing things.
And you hear people say it, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
I can't handle this.
Yeah.
We hear it all the time, right? The third is that freeze. And freezes are always very interesting for me because freeze in the therapy world can be seen as disassociation, right? And you know it when you see it. You literally are like, are you even there? The person literally just becomes absent. The overwhelming sense of whatever the emotion is in that threat, and again, that threat can be just, am I enough? Can cause the person to really just almost leave their body. What I have found, this is just my own personal experience working with my clientele, my clients who got really, really keen at that freeze response and really, really expert at that disassociation tended to have these adverse experiences and these traumatic events pre-verbal or very, very young, where the event created a scenario where it was so scary and so intense, the emotion, and they were too young to be able to fight. And they were too young to be able to get up and walk out. And they were too young to be able to talk themselves out of it.
Yeah.
And so their only option was, I just got to leave my body. I just have to disconnect. Right. And so we hear this, we get paralyzed with fear. We hear that term all the time, or I just checked out. And then appease, here I often call it fawn, right? Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. But you're right, freeze and appease is, I see, though you can get it in men as well. I see it really common in women. It's like, what do I need to do to secure my safety here? Do I need to make you happy? What can I do to make you happy? This looks like people pleasing. This looks like lack of boundaries, right? No boundary setting. This looks like I will deprioritize myself and put all of my needs on the back burner to meet your needs in order to maintain my security and my safety with connection or anything else. And all of that looks like this deep need for validation. And also, I would say, becomes the, catalyst for perfectionism, right? So you have those. And in women, I end up going all the way over to the burnout stage because they're doing this. It becomes such a part of their being. They work in life in every scenario through that appease phase, just like I was in a hypervigilance fight phase for 20 years, that it will lead to burnout.
Wow, there's so much in it, isn't there? And I didn't realize what state I was my default until my husband had an accident. It was just a minor accident where he was feeding the dog and the massive dog can, he went to drop it and it came down on top of his fingers and almost cut a couple of his fingers off. But he's asking me to get the tea towel and I'm just like running around flapping and I'm like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And I got this dirty tea towel and chucked it at him and he's like, not that. And I ran across the road and I said to the neighbour, help, help, and she came over and she's asking me to do something. And I literally couldn't think and I couldn't move. And it wasn't until that point that I thought, oh, this is freeze. I've been operating on freeze mode my whole life. Every time something gets difficult or every time something's traumatic, and it takes a lot of work to actually work this all out. And
No doubt.
I love that we're talking about this today. I was just at the opening for the National Trauma Centre of Australia a couple of weeks ago. And we've never had anything like this before. And it's a world-class trauma centre here right near where I live. It's such a massive topic. And I think the message that would be good for us to get out today too is that trauma and PTSD is often associated with veterans and people that are first responders.
Right.
But there's so many more reasons why people experience trauma and post-traumatic stress.
Absolutely. And, here in the States, we talk a lot about complex PTSD, and people often want to know what the difference is. And the best way that I can explain it is, at least from my seat, is I always see PTSD as maybe a handful or maybe one acute, very traumatic event. Whereas complex PTSD or developmental trauma is basically you have a prolonged chronic series of stressful events and traumatic events all happening during your developmental years, because it becomes complex because it actually changes the way that you see yourself.
Yeah.
Right? It's that self-actualization, it's that self-esteem of, do I matter? Am I enough? Am I significant? Do I belong? And that ends up then changing the way you see not just yourself, but it really interferes with how you interact with other people and the entire world around you. It creates an entire lens that you're wearing that you don't even know you're wearing.
Yeah. And it runs off these false self-defeating beliefs, these core beliefs that we form based on the events that we go through when we're children.
100%.
Yeah. And they end up defeating us as we get older.
They do, and that's why somebody would essentially come and work with me, and one of the unique modalities that I've decided to become trained in and that I'm a practitioner of is something known as rapid transformational therapy. And one of the reasons why I made the decision to go through that rigorous training was because it really was, from my point of view, a great way for me to get to that core belief, because
Yeah.
our core beliefs are rooted in our subconscious. So I knew I needed some sort of hypnotherapy model, something done under hypnosis so I could access the subconscious and allow the client to see from their own words and from their own experiences the core beliefs that they needed to, as an adaptation, to create in order to survive what felt like a very unsurvivable thing at the moment, but that they're still living from that seat
Yeah.
40, 50 years later. And when they can see it, and then I can help them reframe it at the subconscious level, it sticks at the subconscious level. And it really allows them to now start to make these micro shifts from a new core belief that I am enough, or I do matter, or my needs are important,
I am safe.
that I am safe and safety is available to me. When they can start to live their life through that seat and from that lens of core belief, then all of their thoughts change based on that core belief. And then their actions change and their behaviors change, and they end up finding themselves less triggered and living more of a peaceful life.
Wow, yeah, that's very wise words there. And it's difficult for people that have been through adverse childhood trauma, because there are so many triggers. moving into adult life. And I myself have many, many triggers. But I think
Yeah.
the wonderful thing for anybody listening is that there is hope, because once you do this work and reach out for help, work out what your triggers are, have an action plan, change your core beliefs, get some new perceptions that are going to be life-giving, there's great hope to recover from trauma. And Stacey and
Absolutely.
myself are living proof of that. So, Stacey, as a young person then coming out of that very, very difficult situation with your parents and the family dynamics, I've worked in schools for a lot of years, and I've worked with many young people that are in that similar situations. You know, overnight, their whole world changes. Parents break up, they're chucked into a new family, and they don't get on with the new family. They've got siblings all of a sudden. They're living in a house with strangers, and their whole world's just catapulted into darkness. Those kids that I worked out with started acting up, playing out, turning to substances, self-harm. So how did things play out for you? Because I know you mentioned before that you became a pleaser,
I didn't actually become the pleaser. I became the fighter.
a fighter. Okay,
Yeah. So I would say my sibling became the
sorry.
pleaser.
Right.
I was the fighter. And, I got shamed for that because I was told I was difficult. I was told that I had a mouth on me, meaning I cursed a lot. And I think there was probably, in retrospect, I was a heavy cursor growing up. And I think it was because I didn't feel heard when
Yeah.
I was trying to express myself and saying, this is not okay. And I don't feel safe. And what is going on? And how did this happen? And I didn't feel like it was being addressed because everything was still so negative and so chaotic. I really started leaning on, how can I get your attention?
Yeah.
And cursing really got that attention.
Right.
So I got really shamed and blamed for that behavior, right? I was seen as the town crier because I was going around to anybody that would listen to say, we have a problem here. I
Okay.
was told I was an exaggerator. I was told I was a pot stirrer, and I heard all these things growing up. And what was interesting is I didn't go into these big T behaviors, right? I never got into, I used substances, but I never was addicted to substances. I wasn't promiscuous. I never tried to run away. I wasn't having disciplinary issues. So I think everybody thought I was fine. But
Yeah.
even if those things had happened, I don't think anybody would have been connecting the dots, honestly, in the 80s. No way. They just wouldn't have been. But I had all of these things that were being said about me. And then that made me feel further disconnected from my family of origin. Because I'm like, you're creating this. And now you're blaming me for reacting, but I didn't ask for this. And I have no control over being in this environment. The
Yeah.
way it negatively impacted me long term was because I couldn't predict who and what I was going to be coming up against every single day from age 11 until, say, age 19. I carried deep hypervigilance in my system.
And it was a protection
I
measure.
absolutely, but I didn't know that at the time.
Yeah.
I walked with tremendous anxiety. I was having such a difficult time sleeping. I couldn't eat. I was so incredibly thin. I couldn't do well in school. My mind, I couldn't focus. I couldn't give attention to the things that I needed to be able to give attention to. I'm very bright, but I was not a good student at that time. Um,
Something that we have, well, people that aren't working in this field don't realize, but if children are suffering emotionally, they can't learn.
that's right. And
Something
I knew enough to
stops
be
them
able
from
to say to
learning.
my mom, she would say, "What's going on with this grade?" And I said to her, "I'm so stressed out. I can't even think." I was
Yeah.
able to say that, and I have a memory of saying that to her. But the reality is that nobody was picking up the breadcrumbs. And I would say that this went on until my early 30s. And so this is now 15 years of me being in this hypervigilant state. And if we know anything about, our nervous system and our autonomic nervous system and the vagus nerve and all of these different modalities, polyvagal theory, what have you, I was in this hypervigilance. I must and I can try to fix this and try to feel better for so long that at some point my body just said, it's not sustainable. You're not going to outrun this. And I just started to flop. And I went from complete anxiety to now what people would label as a depressive state. The confusion for me was that I didn't feel sad. I
Right.
just couldn't function.
Yeah.
So, I kept saying to my husband, I know this feels like depression because I don't want to get out of bed. I can't focus. I can't, when I get to work, something very easy and normal, like responding to an email, I can't even do that. I'm paralyzed. I've now gone from this fight and flight stage to now this freeze stage, right? Because I've been in that for so long, it wasn't sustainable for my nervous system. You could almost call it like a nervous breakdown. Because I just completely broke down. And I remember saying to my dad during that time, I'm not depressed because I'm not sad. There's nothing in my life to be sad about. I have so much gratitude. I don't feel any of it. I feel nothing.
Yeah.
I'm completely numb. And I said to him, I have a really great support system and I recognize that, but I can totally understand why somebody would do anything not to feel this way.
Okay. Yeah.
That was a very scary moment for me. That was 20 years ago. So I've been through the whole cycle of how these wounds that we endure as children, when they're unhealed in the moment and unresolved, can have a long-term negative impact on what I'll call our mental health and our state of our well-being.
And I totally agree. Nearly every middle-aged client that comes to me, it's always as a result of unresolved childhood trauma.
Yeah. And it's funny because on my website, I talk about that pretty clearly. And, I call it the elephant in the room. And I say on my website, listen, if you're going to work with me, we're going to go there. And if you think that that's too much too fast, then you're not ready to do the work with me, because I can almost guarantee you that it started before you were 15 years old or before you were 11 or 10. Like there's something in there that you learn to adapt in a certain way that's not working for you anymore.
Stacey, before we get on to how you actually healed, I just want to ask you, looking back now, because at the time we don't realize what our self-defeating beliefs are. We all have, probably around 2 or 3 big ones where every time they're triggered, the old tapes start playing and we run into that old behavior. Looking back now, can you identify what the self-defeating beliefs that you ran off your entire life were?
Yeah, I think one was it's my job to protect everyone.
Okay.
That's a really tough thing to do.
Wow. Okay.
That's a really big, hard one to do. And I found myself 2 summers ago in deep breaking mode of that one. Just 2 summers ago, 50 years old, right? Because I didn't realize I was still carrying that piece and it was starting to interfere with my life. So I think it's my job to be the person that everybody can rely on for protection and to get people to do the right thing. I can feel it. I was wearing that and I had to put that cape down. And I think honestly, the other really big core belief, and it's funny because I've actually never really put this into words until you've asked me this, is that I don't have anybody I can rely on that's older than me. I mean, I had 1 or 2 people, but it wasn't my parents.
Right.
I went from being able to rely on them very young to not being able to rely on them overnight because they weren't making decisions that were in my best interest. I became hyper independent, which if anybody works with trauma knows it's very much a trauma response. And it comes from this idea of I can only rely on me.
Yeah. And when we peel that away with clients, what sits at the base of that is I'm alone.
And that was my trauma. There's
Yeah.
no question about that.
And for me.
There's no question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to talk about that because I do a lot of work in this area. And when people can get hold of this stuff and actually understand, then that knowledge is the start of healing, isn't it?
100%. Yep.
So so you had this massive breakdown. It almost sounds also like chronic fatigue syndrome if you were to go to a doctor and be diagnosed.
Listen, I've been diagnosed already with 2 autoimmune conditions. This does not surprise me.
Yeah, yeah.
You're in that zone, you know.
So you've talked about the physical and behavioural signs of that depression, and I think it's really important that you talked about the fact that you didn't feel sad, because feeling sad doesn't necessarily mean you do or don't have something going on. It's looking at the overall picture of what's happening. So after that, what actually was the pivotal moment that led you to get help or find the right help?
That's the key, right? So, like I had mentioned, I'd been in therapy starting in 1986. So I was 15 years old at that time until I was in my early 30s. And at the end of that 20-year journey, I was frustrated because I was still walking with tremendous anxiety and panic, or that fight or flight in my system. But I was being told by therapists, I don't really know why you're here. Because I had done so much work, I was telling them everything, in the sense that I knew it. I knew it all. I had a good understanding of my system and what was happening for me emotionally. I knew my story. I had done so much work up to this point. They basically were like, "There's nothing really I can do for you," was
And you had
basically
that
the
confident
message.
facade as well, because you'd been used to
Yes,
wider and covering everything up and fixing everything.
100%. I masked very well.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that felt me leaving very powerless and helpless and hopeless with no agency, right? And a lot of what I was hearing was, listen, you come from a long line of people with anxiety and depression. It's no wonder that you have it. It's kind of your birthright. Here's some Zoloft and off you go. And the reality is that the Zoloft did feel better. It did give me it did help me grow my window of tolerance, in the sense that it allowed my nervous system to take a breath.
And some
And
people
that
very much do need medication.
and I did. It expanded my capacity to breathe. I wasn't even breathing. And when you can do these things and you can rest your nervous system and you can rest and digest and get into that space, you have more capacity to sit back and look at everything. The thing is that for me in particular, because I wasn't getting to the core, it was like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. So at some point, that medication stopped working for me. After that, what I'm going to call first nervous breakdown, I had a second one about 10 years later in my early 40s. And it was very situational, to the sense that there was something really, really big happening in my life. And part of it was a natural response to the event, but mine was a very exaggerated response to the event, right? Because this was touching on everything: my safety, my security, where I stand in my family, having a parent abandon me, feeling betrayed. All these wounds just got nailed with this one huge event. And my nervous system just absolutely collapsed. My problem was, at that time, I walked with such a deep gratitude practice. So I was very confused, because in my mind, I understood it all, but my body was not connected to my mind. It was completely disconnected. So I was having 2-3 week long panic attacks where I couldn't get a breath, and it would last and last and last, which, if anybody's ever experienced that, is very debilitating. So I decided not to go back to a therapist, and I found a clinical hypnotherapist who wasn't a therapist but trained in hypnosis, and was much more of a spiritual coach and a spiritual guide, and it was life changing for me. because it was the first time I ever got to do inner child work at the subconscious level. And it allowed me to see and heal parts of me that were this elevated anxiety in my system. And that began the journey for me of doing very, very different work. So I got very, very curious about all of this. I started diving very heavy into Brene Brown's work, the work of Don Miguel Ruiz. And those two books and those two authors really exposed me to a whole other area of healing I didn't know I needed and I didn't know existed.
Wow, that's great. And look at you today. Can you give us a snapshot of what life is like today for you?
Peaceful.
Oh,
And I think people need to understand that peace does not mean that we're never in the storm. And peace does not mean that we don't endure trials and tribulations and that I don't have anxiety because my nervous system will still react. But peace for me is the decrease in frequency, how often it happens, how long it stays in my system, how intense it is. When those things can be decreased and they're more in alignment with the reality of the situation versus a perceived threat, it gives me so much hope that my nervous system can be okay. And when our nervous system is intact, the rest of us can be intact. So that feels like freedom for me.
wow, that's great. And you're not alone these days. You don't feel alone. You've got a lovely husband.
I do not feel alone. And it took me a very long time to realize that that was a core wound. Like I would say I did not realize that till my mid 40s.
Yeah.
And there have been beautiful examples along the way of people I don't even know coming out of the woodwork in support of me of different things, literally saying to me, "You're not alone in this." And I think to myself, you really have no idea how powerful those words are.
Oh, no, I know.
Right?
I'm really touched by just when you just shared that because it's something that I can really identify with. Stacey, as we come to a close now, what's a message that you'd love to leave everyone with that's listening today?
I have a saying on my website when you first get to it that says, "You are not broken." And I feel so strongly about it because that's a language that a lot of people use. I'm so broken. Nothing will work for me. I'm unfixable. And I'm always so I'm always so passionate about telling people to be careful about the language that they use on themselves, right? This is the first agreement of be impeccable with your word from the 4 agreements, even with yourself. When we tell ourselves that we're broken, when we tell ourselves that we're so damaged we can't be fixed or that we need to be fixed even,
Yeah.
it sends a message to yourself of not having any agency over your life. And what I'll say to everybody is you're not broken. You're just still running your life through the playbook of adaptation that you had to create at a certain time, that it's just not relevant anymore. And if you can find the right person to work with to recognize, how did I learn to cope that was brilliant at the time, that's maladaptive now? And if I can recognize that, who can help me look at those behaviors, put them to rest, thank them for all the work that they did for us, and give us a new set of behaviors that we want to walk into this next chapter of life with?
Thank you. Very powerful words. And you are just a true testament of hope to anybody out there that's has experienced trauma, is going through trauma and wonders if they're ever going to get through trauma. So thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Kintsugi Heroes. Please like and share the show to your friends so we can get this out to even more people. If you have a story you'd like to share with us, please reach out using the contact details below. And join us next week for our next hero's story. Until then, keep being you and remember that we are all heroes in our own unique way.
it's broken. Only when it's broken. When it hits you in the middle of the night and the truth burns so bright. Only when it's broken. Only when it's broken. Take pride in those cries. It's only for tonight, and then you rise. Only when you're broken. Only when you're broken. Only when